All right, let's go ahead and get started here. My name is Eric Green, and I'm going to be leading the webinar today for Clash of the JavaScript Titans, Backbone.js and Angularjs. Go ahead and here's our title slide. So what we're going to be doing is we're basically going to be kind of doing an overview. We're going to be looking at Backbone.js and Angularjs and kind of doing a comparison and contrast between the two. Now, for the purposes of doing this comparison, we're going to be using basically plain vanilla Backbone and plain vanilla Angular. Both Backbone and Angular are both, extensible JavaScript library frameworks that you can add all types of capabilities to and change capabilities and that kind of thing. And in many ways, you can make Backbone very much behave kind of like Angular in terms of two-way data binding and that kind of thing. And you can do things to Angular to improve its routing system and stuff. So start getting into all those combinations. The differences between the two of them kind of start to disappear a little bit. And so in order to really look at this from a purist type of standpoint, we're going to look at a plain vanilla Backbone and plain vanilla Angular, and we're going to take a look at the problems that they try to solve, the concepts that are employed in both of them, and try to understand why each one takes the approach that it does and what are the pluses and minuses for that. So a little bit of information about me. I'm a web application developer. I've been writing web applications for almost 18 years now. I've been doing JavaScript for 18 years. I do a lot of JavaScript training. I spend right now most of my time actually teaching Angular courses, but I'm going to do my best to present this from an unbiased standpoint between Backbone and Angular. WebAge Solutions is a premier provider of training and mentoring services. If you're looking for information on how to develop Backbone applications or create Angular applications, WebAge can provide those services and send out a qualified trainer to work with your team of people to help them learn more about these technologies and how to use them to solve your clients' problems. Okay, so here's kind of a quick overview of what we're going to take a look at today. We're first going to define the problem to be solved. Developers didn't sit around and create Backbone and Angularjs just for the purpose of creating it. These libraries / frameworks were created for a purpose. And so we're going to first identify the problem that they're actually trying to solve. Next, we're going to talk about the concept of a framework versus a library. If you go to the Backbone.js website, you'll see where they talk about various reasons for using Backbone. They'll emphasize that it's a library, and that's a good thing in terms of why you should choose to use Backbone over Angular. And yet, when you talk about Angular or you talk about Ember or other frameworks like that, we use the word framework instead of library. So I want to talk about what the difference is between the two of those concepts and what are the benefits or maybe the negatives of each. And then the next thing we're going to take a quick look at is we're going to talk about two-way data binding. In most of the classes, JavaScript classes that I teach, when I come across folks who want to have the discussion of do I use Angular or don't I use Angular or do I use Backbone and that kind of thing, the big issue typically tends to be the issue of two-way data binding and how that can possibly impact the performance of an application. And then finally, at the end, I want to take a quick look at the two sample projects that we're going to be walking through in the course of our discussion. In those projects, I actually am using a thing called Browserify and the CommonJS module system to actually build these applications. A lot of folks, when they build web apps, they use Bower as their package manager for their various web packages. And I do that too for a lot of my applications, but I've also been playing around with Browserify, and I want to show you how we can make use of that to actually build web applications as well. And then finally at the end, I'll do a conclusion and kind of sum up everything. Now my plan is to speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then at the end for the last 10 or 15 minutes we'll open it up to questions, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that you have. Okay, so the question is, what problem do JavaScript solutions like Backbone and Angular.js try to solve? Ultimately, when we create web applications using these big JavaScript frameworks, at the end of the day, we're really trying to solve the same problem. And the idea is we're trying to create applications that don't require us to go back to the server every single time we want to change the view. And by go back to the server, I don't mean download a JavaScript file or download a template. I mean actually do a full-blown page reload where we actually post a bunch of data or do a get and go back to the server and basically re-download our entire HTML page, re-download our JavaScript, our CSS, our images and stuff like that, and do this full-blown page reload. Instead, we want to create web applications that function more like a desktop app, where basically I have a particular screen or a view or a page, however you want to term it, that you're looking at. And then I want to be able to kind of go from page to page to page without having to reload the entire thing. Essentially, I want to remove one part of the DOM and replace it with another view without having to reload the entire thing. And so over the course of time, many developers have created their own little homegrown libraries, their own DOM manipulation code, and they tried to accomplish these various things for building these single-page applications. And then along the line, people started building real libraries and then eventually frameworks that would do this for you, and you could reuse them over multiple applications. One of these was called Backbone, and Backbone has been popular for many years now. And basically, Backbone is what's called a JavaScript library, and it basically would take care of setting up your models for you, providing collections for those models, the ability to route, which is the term that's used when you want to go from page to page to page in your application without having to reload it. It would set up routing for you and then be able to display views. Okay? Well, Angular.js is a framework, and it also does many of those same things, but it also adds some additional stuff as well. So when you boil it down, there's really four things that these single-page applications need to be able to do for you in order to avoid having to go back to the server every single time you want to change your view. The first thing is we need a way to manage our UI, basically swap our templates in and out, and actually change our routes, and then manage our application data. We also need a method for accessing network resources, specifically REST services that have our data. If we can't go back to the web server for page reloads all the time, then we still have to have a way to take data from our UI and actually pass it up to the server, have the server do something with it, and then give us back some kind of result. And then next we need a routing system, and that's that process of going page to page. And then we need a template system where once we do go to a particular route and we want to display our view, we need a templating system that will actually allow us to take that template and bind it to some type of data source, and then we'll actually render a view with our data in it. Okay, so that's the basic problem that these libraries and frameworks are trying to solve. And honestly, it doesn't really matter whether you're using Backbone or Angular or Ember or Meteor or React or any number of other libraries and frameworks. At the heart of all of them, they're either trying to solve all of these problems or they're trying to solve one or two of these problems, and that's basically the goal of these JavaScript libraries. Okay, so framework or library, what's the difference between the two of these? Now, this definitely starts to get into a little bit of opinion in terms of how a person chooses to define what a library or a framework is. If I were to ask anybody in this crowd here, what is jQuery? everybody would instantly reply that jQuery is a JavaScript library. And the reason people would reply like that is because jQuery doesn't really tell them how to structure their application. jQuery just gives you some utilities, like a Swiss Army knife kind of, some utilities for actually managing your web application on the client side. It gives you some DOM selection tools. It gives you some DOM manipulation tools. It gives you some tooling to do AJAX calls. It even includes a promise library and some utilities like doing animation and that kind of thing. But jQuery itself doesn't structure your application for you. It just gives you an easy way to work with the DOM and some other browser capabilities. All right, so let's take a look at Backbone first. Backbone basically provides you with some ways for you to manage your model, to manage a collection of models. It also gives you a way to do routing, and it also kind of gives you kind of a framework for handling views. But what does Backbone not do? Number one, Backbone doesn't actually force your application into a particular structure. You can use Backbone for part of your application. You can use any type of templating library that you'd like to use for your application. You can use any type of AJAX type of tooling that you'd like to use. Backbone doesn't dictate everything about how your application is going to be structured and set up. Okay, it basically provides you some utilities for managing your model, managing the collections, setting up routing, and then being able to hook into a view, as well as to do some event stuff. All right. Angular, on the other hand, is different. Angular provides you an entire opinionated structure for how your application is going to be set up. It covers everything, not only from your routing and how you're going to handle your data, but it also provides its own promise library. It provides its own HTTP service mechanism for sending your data up and down. It's got an entire two-way data binding system. It provides its own templating system and the way its templates work with its entire directive system for widgets. It basically has very opinionated about how you're going to do lots of different things in your application. And then it provides you this entire module structure by which you're actually going to organize it. Okay? So it has a lot more control. Now, the benefit of that is that you give up some of your freedom to get some of the benefits of what Angular and actually pick a two-way data binding system and hook that into Backbone. You're not limited to using one or the other. So when we think about these differences with libraries, libraries basically help solve a couple of problems, but don't tell you overall how to solve your problem. And they tend to be much more flexible. With frameworks basically give you an entire thing that helps manage your entire application. And then you can integrate other libraries as you want to, but you have to do so within the opinionated structure of the way the framework wants you to set up your application. All right, so what are the benefits and costs of using these frameworks and libraries? Well, number one, whether you're using a framework or a library, one of the huge benefits of making use of these other frameworks and libraries is you don't have to write the code. I remember long before jQuery ever came out having to write all of my own DOM manipulation code and having to make it cross-browser. It's so much easier to use jQuery. Even for doing routing and views, I could write my own router if I want to, but it's much easier to use the router that comes with Backbone, or making use of the routing options that are available for Angular. I could create my own templating system, but that would also be a pain. It's much better to use somebody else's. So one of the great benefits of using frameworks and libraries is that we don't have to recreate the wheel. We get to use proven, tested code that's well supported, well documented, and has shown to be very effective in solving problems. Now, the benefit of choosing a library over a framework in terms of, let's say, choosing Backbone is you do have a lot more flexibility. If you don't agree with the opinionated structure of your framework, by using a library, you're not forced into that opinionated structure. With Angular.js now, with using a framework, one of the benefits is that you do have a way to structure your application, and it does handle a lot more things out of the box for you than what Backbone would do. For example, to set up a simple Angular application really requires a few lines of code to basically get a hello world up and running. With Backbone, you tend to have to write a lot more code to just kind of get something up and running to begin with. Okay. Now, the downside of that is you are locked into Angular structure. So the benefits of frameworks and libraries is to make use of proven code and save time. The cost of a library is you have to do more coding up front to get something up and running. The benefit of a framework is less coding up front. However, the downside of a framework is you do lose some of that flexibility. And if you stick with a library like Backbone.js, you get to keep that flexibility. Okay? So those are the differences between a framework and a library. Okay. So what I want to do now is I want to take a look at some actual code. I'm going to jump over here. Let me close these windows. All right. For those who can't maybe see all that well on their screen, over here in my corner, you're going to see where I have an Angular folder and I have a Backbone folder. This is basically an Angular application that manages a list of widgets, and this is a Backbone application that manages a list of widgets. They're approximately the same application, so they're a good tool for comparison. So what I want to do is I want to take a look at a couple of the different features that Backbone and Angular provide, and I want to talk about where Backbone gives us some flexibility, whereas Angular might be more opinionated. I want to take a look at some of their common capabilities and where some of the differences are between the two of them. Okay. The first thing I want to take a look at is routing. For me, routing is probably one of the biggest reasons to actually make use of a single-page framework. So let's take a look at Angular.js first. I'm going to open up some code here that actually defines and creates my routes. Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar with Angular, Angular has a default type routing system called ng-route. It used to be included in the core of Angular, but now it's distributed as a separate module, but it is kind of the default routing mechanism that comes with Angular, even though there are some other alternatives. So let's take a look at how ng-route sets up stuff here. In Angular, we have these things called services. And there's this thing called the route service, which is used to actually do the routing mechanism in Angular. In order to configure that route service so that we can actually set up our routes, we have to use something called a route provider, which is what you see being injected in here. So one of the things that you heard me say the word injected. One of the things that Angular.js has as part of its opinionated framework is the use of dependency injection. So dependency injection, for most people, they're used to using that maybe in Java or C#. But one of the things that Angular does in JavaScript is actually has a full-blown dependency injection system that is used to inject services into the various components of Angular. And so here you can see where we're injecting our route provider, which will be used to configure the routes for our application. So if we come in here, we're going to see that we basically have the ability to specify different routes. So when I'm on the home page, I'm going to be using a particular controller, and I'm going to be using a particular template. When I'm viewing a widget, I'm going to be using a particular controller and a particular template. So basically, as I go from route to route to route, it's basically changing my controller and changing my template. So now the question is, what's a controller? most people can kind of guess what a template is. That's basically just going to be the HTML that's going to be displayed for that particular route. So if we came in here and looked at, for example, our home template, you can see that my home template is basically going to display a list of widgets. A controller in Angular is used to basically set up our data model. In Angular, it's called scope, but basically our scope would roughly be equivalent to models in Backbone. And so we're going to use our controller here to basically set up our scope. So if we take a look here, I'm basically using my widget service, which is going to contact my REST services to download my widgets. And it's going to download all of my widgets, and then once my widgets are downloaded, it's going to assign that result data to my $scope.widgets. Now, one thing you're going to notice here is there's a .then coming off of my service. Angular.js, being a framework, provides its own promise library that's been designed to integrate with its two-way data binding system. And so when I pull in my widgets with getAll, I'm going to be using this promise infrastructure for basically updating my data model. So one of the things that Angular has is promises, and the reason it includes them is because the promise service that Angular uses ties directly into something called the digest loop. And the digest loop, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is the mechanism by which we achieve two-way data binding within an Angular.js application. Now, in Backbone out of the box doesn't support two-way data binding. So there isn't a built-in promise service that needs to integrate with that with Angular or with Backbone, because Backbone doesn't support that at all. So if you come into our home controller, you can see where I'm downloading some widgets, and I also have a method here that allows me to delete a widget. So let's go ahead and fire up our Angular application. You can kind of see what this thing looks like. Now, there's nothing too aesthetically pleasing about this. It's just more for functionality than for style. But let me load up my web browser here. Localhost 8080. All right, so here's my widget manager. And I basically have a list of widgets. And if we come back to our code here, you'll see where we had this delete function. So if I come back to my list of widgets, I can click on delete. And when I click on delete, it's going to delete the widget. There you go. So now the widget is gone. And if I were to come back in here and reload my page, you'll see that it really is, in fact, actually gone. It just wasn't removed from the DOM. So basically what I use a controller for is I use a controller to wire up actions, and then in those actions I can then do things like modify my data. In this case, I'm using my widget service to call delete. I pass in the widget ID I want to delete. You'll notice this special then function again, which is our promise setup. And then after I delete it, then I go ahead and get all my widgets again, just for simplicity purposes. And then I update my widget data with my result here. Okay? So this is kind of an example of Angular routing. We have our route, we have our controller, which sets up our data model, including setting up our event handlers, and then we have our template that we display. Now let's take a look at a similar concept here in Backbone. If I come over to my end my Angular application here, and I'm going to switch to Backbone. Sorry. The problem with using Linux and Windows all the time, the backslashes versus the forward slashes. All right, let's type grunt. I'm going to fire up our service again. And all of this interesting stuff that you see popping up here for my grunt tasks for minifying and stuff, I'll try to mention that at the end. I can show you what that looks like real quick. So I'm going to just reload the same page now. The web server runs on the same port. So now I have a widget manager in Backbone, and you can see that I have my list of widgets here, and then I have my various actions like view and edit that I can click on. Now, let's jump over to Backbone and let's take a look at the routing system in Backbone. So here I have a file called Widgets.js, which is in my routers folder, and this is going to set up my routes for Backbone. Now, if we take a look here, we're going to see that our routes look actually quite similar. Notice we have widget/:id, and if we go back over to our Angular route, we'll see we have like /view/:widget ID. So the routing mechanism, the concept behind it is actually, pretty similar. We have this URL that we're trying to match a pattern to, and then here we have our view widget route handler. So let's go down to our view widget function here, and we can kind of see what this looks like. All right. So now for view widget, we're basically checking to see if our current view is already set up, and if it is, we're going to undelegate the events. And so that basically is going to remove any event handlers that currently exist. And then we're going to create a new view widget view, and this is going to reference our view widget view object, and it's going to set some various things, like for example, setting our model and setting our router, and as well as setting up our DOM element here, and then we're going to render our view. Okay? So in Backbone, we kind of have to do a little bit more work here. We not only have to specify our view object, but then we actually have to pass in all of this data, and then we actually have to tell it to render. If we come back over here, all we had to do was specify the template and the controller, and Angular took care of everything else for us. We didn't have to tell it to render. We didn't really have to pass in anything. It kind of did all the data binding and put it together for us on its own. Over here, we actually had to do a lot more work. Well, not a lot more, but a little bit more work to make it happen. But now let's actually go take a look at the view widget view. So if we go over here to our views folder, I'm going to go to my view widget view. All right. Actually, let's see here. Anyways, okay. Let's see. All right. So here's an example of our view. So come in here, you're going to notice that we have our events set up. I have a template URL. Now, template URL was something that I actually added to this because I wanted to be able to download my template from the server instead of having to have it like inline coded into my application. But this actually wasn't something that was originally here in Backbone. I actually had to do that myself. So if I wanted to, like for example, in this case with Angular, I could specify template URL, and Angular took care of downloading the template from the web server. Whereas over here, let's see here. Whereas here, I actually had to add this in myself to actually download it. So Backbone doesn't do that automatically for you. And then we come in here, and you'll see where we have our events set up. Now, this is very similar in the sense that I had to, for example, specify delete widget over here on my controller. Let's see here. On my home controller, I had to write my delete widget code. Well, over here, wrong tab, sorry, I had to write my delete widget code. Not a big deal there. So basically the same process for that. And then down here, I actually had to implement my render function. Now, in Angular, I didn't have to do that. But the reason why I have to implement my render function in Backbone is because Backbone, being a library, is not opinionated concerning what template system you use. So since it doesn't know what template system you're using, you can use any template system you want to. Well, each template system has its own different way of compiling the template and applying data to it and that whole process. So in Backbone, instead of it just doing it for you, you actually have to write the code to actually do that render process, yourself. And then down here, I have this little this little template system for pulling down a template. This is definitely not what I consider to be a best practice because I actually have async set defaults here. But this was something I was playing around with earlier today, just to download the template URL and see if I could, make it work like that with Backbone to kind of show a comparison with Angular. But in order to do this, I actually have to provide my own code. It doesn't do it out of the box for me. So with Backbone, I get a routing mechanism. I have the ability to do some pattern matching against routes and then have it execute some code. But then within that code, I have to specify my template system. I have to implement any type of downloading of templates. I have to manually compile and write my render function. And so while Backbone provides me some functionality, it doesn't provide me this overall structure. Whereas here with Angular, it provides me the overall structure, and I have to write a lot less code. So it just depends upon which approach you prefer. If you're the kind of person that really wants to have control over everything, and you want to dictate every detail, and you're not willing to trade away a little bit of that flexibility to have a little bit stronger structure and not have to do as much, then Backbone is the way for you. If you're okay trading away some of that flexibility, you don't mind using Angular's templating system, you don't need to select your own templating system, then Angular is a good option for you. It just depends upon what your philosophy on all that is. All right? So this is kind of a good comparison here in terms of the routing mechanism and how Angular does it one way and then Backbone does it another. Backbone provides less functionality, but gives you more flexibility. Angular requires you to do less out of the box, but you have to do it the Angular way. All right, so the next big contentious issue between Backbone and Angular has to do with the concept of two-way data binding. And really, this doesn't even so much have to do with Backbone and Angular per se. This is actually a much larger topic of discussion and argument between software developers as to whether or not you should even be doing two-way data binding with your web applications. In fact, some developers even go so far as to say that two-way data binding is almost an anti-pattern. And so the concept of two-way data binding is this. In all template systems, they all definitely support one-way data binding, and that's basically taking a data model, passing it into the template, and creating a view that has that data. In fact, if we look at line 27 here in my Backbone view, you'll see where I have my compiled template, and what am I doing? I'm passing data into it. Angular is the same way. In Angular, you have the compile service. You compile your template. It creates something called a linking function. That linking function is then called with what? It's called with your data. You call the linking function, pass in your scope data. The result is you get a real live view that has your data bound to your template. So all templating systems support one-way binding. But then there's this other concept called two-way binding. And the idea in two-way data binding is that, let's say I have a form, for example. So I'm going to kill this process here. We'll switch back over to Angular, fire that up, reload, click Edit. So take a look at our form here. The idea in two-way data binding is that basically I can type in information into these input boxes, and this information will actually go back to the model and be updated on the model. So I'm not just taking model data and pushing it out to the view. I'm actually able to take the data typed into the view and have it automatically pushed back to the model. Okay? In fact, probably the most classic example of this in Angular, I'm going to go to the home page here, and just right here at the top, we'll put a couple of BR so it'll push everything down to the bottom of the screen. I'm going to put in a little input control and put type text ng model message. All right. And then we'll say message. Okay, so I'm going to save that. Go back to my web browser. Let's go back to the home page. We're going to reload. All right, everybody see my message box up here at the top? In fact, let's put a few more BRs above that. There we go. So watch this. Everybody see how that works? So basically, as I type into the input box, then that data gets pushed back to the model, and then that model data automatically updates the view everywhere that particular property is referenced. So in this case, I have a property on my data model that I created called message, and every time this changes inside the input element, this automatically updates here, okay, on my view. Now, Backbone, the vanilla Backbone, if you want to call it that, does not do this. It has no support for doing two-way data binding, and that's intentional. It's not that Backbone prevents people from doing two-way data binding. If you want to do two-way data binding, you can use external components like Stickit or Knockout, and you can use those libraries with Backbone, and you can get your two-way data binding. But Backbone very intentionally does not do two-way data binding because there are performance problems that can come with two-way data binding. I'll explain those in a second. Angular, on the other hand, requires that you do two-way data binding. Where Backbone doesn't give you the option out of the box, but will let you do it with external libraries, with Angular, you don't have a choice. You have to use two-way data binding. The entire data modeling system of Angularjs is built around the concept of doing two-way data binding. So if you don't want two-way data binding, you really can't use Angular because you're going to get it regardless. However, if you want two-way data binding, it's been my experience that it's definitely a lot easier to make use of it within Angular because it's already built into the entire system. So looking at this, I'm sure as everyone saw me type this out, especially people who maybe don't know that much about Angular or Backbone, thought, hey, that's really cool that you can do that. Why would two-way data binding be a problem? Well, here's the issue with two-way data binding. The key is understanding how JavaScript itself works and how JavaScript runs, especially within a browser. So JavaScript is single-threaded, which means JavaScript only runs on one thread. Okay? And so basically, whatever JavaScript is doing, whatever task it's performing, it does it using a run-to-completion model. So once JavaScript starts doing something, it doesn't do anything else until it finishes that particular task. Okay? Well, in a web browser, JavaScript runs on the same thread as the UI. So basically, when your JavaScript is running in a web browser, the browser cannot do UI updates. So for example, if you have some long-running JavaScript task, you've probably noticed in a web browser you couldn't click a button anymore. You couldn't type in the box as long as that JavaScript task was running. In fact, I'm sure most people here have probably been to websites where you got the message that said, you know, a JavaScript file was taking too long to run or something like that. Would you like to terminate it? And the reason it wanted you to terminate it was because as long as that JavaScript code was running, the browser couldn't do any type of UI updates. It couldn't respond to UI interaction. Okay, with all that said, how does two-way data binding work? Two-way data binding systems all use something called a loop. And basically what the loop does is the loop takes your model data and it basically loops through your model data looking to see if any of the data has changed. And if any of the model data has changed, it then takes that model data and updates the UI with it. Okay? So take our example here. When I'm typing into this box, when this data changes here, there is a looping mechanism that's running that's taking these changes and updating the UI. Well, for my one little field here, it's really, really fast. But if you get a lot of different form elements and a lot of different pieces of data on your model, you could imagine how long that loop could take in terms of processing. And you'll notice here, this loop is running every single time I hit the key on my keyboard. So every time I hit a key there, it ran this whole looping process where it basically went through all of Angular's data models, checked all the properties, synchronized everything, and updated the values on the view. Well, as you can imagine, for a really large web page with a big, huge form, that can definitely take some time. Well, the problem is if that looping process takes longer than 100 milliseconds, it starts to be noticeable to the end user. And so you could envision a scenario where you go to type a character on here, and it takes the loop so long to run that you could actually type multiple characters, but the UI wouldn't be able to keep up with you. And so the big reason that people don't like two-way data binding, or the people who oppose two-way data binding, is they look at that whole looping mechanism and they think there are so much better ways to do this. So in Backbone, instead of having this looping mechanism, Backbone out of the box does something along these lines. Instead of doing a two-way data binding system, when you click Save Widget, you actually just pull the values out of your form like you would have before with jQuery, and then you update your model, and then you can complete your saving process. So just like you did probably even before you used Backbone or Angular or anything else, you always had a way of retrieving those values from the form, updating your object, and then doing something with your object. Well, in the case of Backbone, that's exactly what you do here. Backbone doesn't force you to use two-way data binding because it doesn't offer it out of the box. And instead, you can have your own manual process for pulling in those values, updating your model, and then saving it. Now, I had to do a lot more work here to make this work, as opposed to my Angular application, where I didn't even have to write any JavaScript to make this work. I just put in an input element and put in a template variable here, and I used my ngModel directive, and bam, it just worked for me. Okay, so I didn't even have to do any work to make it happen. So that's one of the big reasons or the big differences between people who like Backbone and people who like Angular. If you're a person who loves two-way data binding, Angular is a good option. If you don't like two-way data binding, or you're opposed to it, whatever, or you want to have your own custom two-way data binding solution, then you can make use of Backbone. One last little comment I want to make on the difference between Backbone and Angular is you'll notice here in my Angular code I have things like ngRepeat and in this case ngModel, and a lot of folks who do Backbone or oppose Angular, they don't like the fact that I have these things called directives inside of my template. They kind of view that as like UI or some type of application logic inside of my template. But the problem is if I go over to my Backbone application, and actually I'm going to load up my template here. If I go to my list widgets template, what do you see right here in my template language? You see the same concept. Instead of it being called ngRepeat, in handlebars it's called #each. The thing is this, is that when you use ngRepeat or you use these directives, you're not really doing application logic. You're doing UI logic. So arguing that Angular.js is bad because you're putting your application logic directly into your template is really a false argument. Only because directives are for doing UI logic, just like #each in handlebars is used for doing UI logic. There's a difference between UI logic and actual application logic. And ngModel or ngRepeat or any of the other Angular directives have nothing to do with your application logic. They're all about how you basically build your view and take your data and apply it to that view. And the thing to remember this too is at the end of the day, the problem that Backbone and Angular are trying to solve is basically how do we build our application's user interface inside of a web browser. So user interfaces are going to have data. In fact, that's the primary purpose of the scope data of the backbone models and collections. It's to manage UI data, not necessarily to manage application data. And then in terms of the templates and the logic that's in them, the purpose of the logic is to build the UI, not actually serve as application logic. All right, so the last thing we want to take a quick look at here, and then we'll open it up to questions, is this whole Browserify concept. Now, if you take a look here at my application, in fact, let me see if I can open this in Explorer. All right, demos. No, that's still pretty small. All right, so inside of my main application file here, let's do it in Angular. You're going to notice that I'm using module.exports equal to this function here, and then down here you're going to see my Angular code, Angular.module, and then you're going to see where I have a bunch of require statements. When I built this application, instead of using something like Bower or even require.js, I made use of the common JS module system that comes as part of Node. Now, my web application isn't running in Node. My web application is running in the web browser. But I'm basically using Node's package management or module system for structuring my application. And that's why you see all of these requires here. So I'm pulling in my constants, my route, my service, and then all of my controllers. So I'm requiring all of these. And then down here at the bottom, you see where I'm returning out my application module. Now, if you go over to my JavaScript folder, you're not going to see you're going to see these files, but you're not going to see Angular. You're not going to be seeing anything like that at all, any of my jQuery files or any of that. All of those are actually down here in my Node modules folder. All right, now my Node modules folder is not within my web browser path. Okay, my web browser path is actually being served out of this dist folder, which I'll explain in a second. But you're going to see where I basically have all of my Node modules here. And so you'll see here on line 23 where it says require jQuery and require Angular. It's pulling Angular and jQuery from the Node modules folder. But the problem is if you were to try to run this in a web browser, you know that it wouldn't work because it's not going to know how to pull files from a Node module folder that's not even in the actual web application folder. So I want to show you what it actually happens here. The actual output of this file looks like this. In my dist folder, I have an app.js file. Now this is a pretty large file, but I'm just going to kind of scroll through it, and you can kind of see what's in here. Using a tool called Browserify, Browserify basically looks at all of those JavaScript files that we've been looking at through the webinar, and it looks at the require statements, and it basically uses that common JS module system and require to pull in all of those JavaScript files into one big app.js file that contains all of my application code. So now when my web page runs, instead of having to load up 20 different application files, I can actually just download one app.js file which contains all of the code for my application. So based upon using those requires, Browserify is able to actually go in there and pull in all of my dependencies, and then this entire block of code gets downloaded to the browser, and everything that's needed to actually run it is then present in the application. It's a little bit different way of structuring your web app, but I think it's kind of interesting, and you can take a look at it, and it's called Browserify. To set it up, you basically have to come into your, let's see here. you'll have to add a task to your grunt file that basically points to your root level file that you need, app.js, and Browserify will then run against app.js, and then it will produce a destination file, which is what I have here. And then one final thing, you'll notice when I started up my web applications, you saw all that text pop up on the screen. I'm basically using a bunch of grunt tasks to pay attention to my files as I change them. And then as I change the files, it actually does various things such as compiling my less file or minifying my JavaScript code. Let's see here. Minifying my CSS, minifying my JavaScript code, and then ultimately it copies everything over to a distribution folder. So even though I've been changing my files in these folders, each time I save them, the grunt task sees that I've modified that file, and it either minifies it, combines it together, what have you, and then copies it over to this dist folder that I have right here, and then I'm actually running the application out of the dist folder. And I actually use the same setup for both Angular and for Backbone. Now, it's easier to set it up with Backbone because Backbone, the actual Backbone library, gets distributed as a common JS module, or it can be distributed as a common JS module. Angular, however, is not distributed as a common JS module, and so in order to make Angular work, I had to basically create a shim for it in my package.json file for Browserify so that basically it would make it work. And so if you're looking to do Angular, you'll have to set up a shim with Browserify to have it actually work with it because Angular is not distributed in the common JS module format. Okay. Well, I went a little bit long here in my presentation, but we definitely can hang around a little past 1 o'clock to take more questions. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions for everybody. What we're going to do is, if you could, just go into the webinar and actually chat me the question. It'll be kind of hard if we had 71 people start talking at once. And I'll take a few questions, and I'll do my best to answer them for you. All right, first question, how do you access data? That's a great question. Okay, so for this web application here, I have a little Node.js REST service that's communicating with actually a SQLite database for our widget list. And so picture whatever your web environment is at work that you have, and so you've got a REST service that interacts with the database. So now you need to have a setup for your web application to contact that REST service to get the data. Ultimately, all of these frameworks and libraries use, at the heart of them, the XML HTTP request object that's built into the web browser that actually makes those actual AJAX calls to the server to download the data. For those with jQuery experience, you know that jQuery has a built-in AJAX function that you can use to access that data, number one. Backbone and Angular each provide their own little mechanism. Backbone provides something called Backbone.sync, and underneath the hood, it actually uses jQuery to make those AJAX request calls for the data. Angular uses something called the HTTP service, and actually I'll show you what that looks like here real quick. It's kind of interesting. In my service here where I'm actually getting my widgets, so we talked about get all earlier, you see where I'm using this HTTP, $HTTP service provided by Angular to actually pull down the widgets. Now looking at this code, it actually looks very similar to jQuery's AJAX call. The difference is the HTTP service, when it goes and gets the data and brings it back down, it basically is hooked into the entire digest loop mechanism of Angular. So the reason why Angular doesn't just use jQuery's mechanism for doing AJAX calls is because after it gets the data, it has to run the digest loop, which does that two-way data binding. So you can see where this two-way data binding actually kind of permeates every aspect of your web application in terms of in terms of a framework, which is really why Angular is more of a framework, because that two-way data binding has to really touch everything. And so in order for Angular to do the two-way data binding and make it manageable, it's so opinionated in terms of how you do things to accommodate that. All right, let's see here. I'm going to break out my list of questions here. All right, so okay, another question was jQuery over Angular. This is actually I get this question every single week. Okay. Believe it or not, Angular has no dependencies. Angular has something built into it called JQLite, which is basically a stripped down version of jQuery. And Angular does all of its DOM manipulation and stuff like that using JQLite. And if you want to build your own directives and stuff like that in Angular, you will make use of JQLite to do that. However, JQLite is horrible. I hate using it. So Angular is set up so that if you include jQuery before you include Angular, then Angular will actually use jQuery for all of its DOM manipulations, and then you can make use of jQuery in your own directives for doing DOM manipulation. So now let's get to the heart of the question. In a lot of people's minds, there's this mentality of I either use jQuery or I use Angular, but I don't use both. But the truth is, Angular uses jQuery if you include jQuery. It's not that you either use jQuery or you use Angular. The fact of the matter is they're both solving two different problems. jQuery provides some utilities for working with the DOM and for doing AJAX calls and stuff. Angular is providing this entire framework for structuring your application. Within that framework, you can make use of jQuery. In fact, I like to look at it like this. Anybody who's ever worked on a large kind of jQuery application knows how quickly that jQuery application can become very hard to manage. People will have 100 different JavaScript files doing jQuery DOM manipulation operations all over the place. They probably have 100 different document.readies, and it's really hard to manage that code. What Angular.js does is Angular.js doesn't get rid of jQuery, not at all. Angular.js provides you structure about when and how you can use jQuery. So take, for example, Angular.js directives. Angular.js directives make use of jQuery to do the DOM manipulation. It's just Angular says you can manipulate the DOM at this point and you can manipulate the DOM at that point and gives you some rules. And so instead of having this kind of Wild West experience of jQuery DOM manipulation all over the place whenever you want to do it, Angular brings some rules in, because it's a framework, and says, hey, you can do all the jQuery you want, but you've got to do it here and you've got to do it over here, and you can't do it anywhere else, because if you do it anywhere else, you're going to cause a lot of problems. Well, that's actually a huge benefit for the developer, because when you go to work on an Angular application, you know where the DOM manipulation is going to occur because Angular's provided a framework and a structure to show you where that DOM manipulation can only occur. Okay? And so you actually use two of them together. And so Angular doesn't get rid of jQuery. In fact, it really makes using jQuery a lot more pleasant of an experience, and it makes the project a lot easier to manage. All right, somebody asked the question of what Uglify is. Uglify is basically a JavaScript minimization tool, and it just takes your JavaScript file and minimizes it, which reduces the amount of bandwidth that's needed when downloading your JavaScript file. Let's see here. Okay, Angular templates, another good question. So Backbone doesn't provide that mechanism to automatically download your templates for you. You have to implement that yourself. Whereas Angular has this template URL mechanism, and it will download templates for you. Now, the thing about it is, it only downloads the template when it needs it. Within Angular, there's this thing called the template cache service. And whenever you request a template in your Angular application, Angular first goes to the template cache service to see if it's already been downloaded. If it hasn't been downloaded, then Angular will go download the template from the web server, put it into the cache, and then you make use of it. But Angular doesn't download all your templates at once. It downloads them as they're needed, and then once they're downloaded, they're accessed from the cache. Now, with Angular, what you can do is you can actually set it up to pre-populate the cache on the initial page load if you want, and then all your templates will automatically be downloaded as part of the initial application loading up, and that will get you a little bit better performance when your application's actually executing. All right, let's see here. Yes, someone had a question about a highly event-driven application. I mean, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, the entire JavaScript model is all about event-driven. I mean, in fact, in JavaScript, that single thread of execution, there's something called the event loop. And so basically, JavaScript fires up and it waits for an event, and then when it gets an event, it executes the task associated with that event, and then it moves on to the next event that shows up. Backbone builds in the ability to have these various events, not only just button clicks and stuff like that, but hooking into events for like the property on your model changed. And so you can hook into a changed event and be able to handle the change to the model. Angular does the same thing. In Angular, you hook into the digest loop using something called a watch, and it will pay attention to your properties, and when those properties change, it will then execute some code. In addition to all of that, Angular's got the full support, of course, for handling click events and any other type of DOM event that may occur that's just part of the web browser. Another question was, what framework should we use for 2D and 3D graphics in JavaScript? Honestly, I'm not really qualified to answer that question. I don't do a lot of graphics type of work in JavaScript. I know that the D3 library is very popular in terms of doing all types of charting and stuff like that. I believe there's another thing out there called Draw.io. You really have two graphics options in HTML. You have SVG and you have the canvas. And SVG is great for doing all types of scalar graphics and stuff like that. But I believe, and I'm saying this just from what I've read, that if you want to do a lot of animation and that type of thing, you use the canvas element. In terms of JavaScript libraries that are out there that help to make that process easier, I don't really have any real experience with those. Let's see here. Someone's asked the question, data masking, and how does that work with Angular.js? I'm not sure I understand exactly what you mean by data masking, so if you want to update your question, I'll try to come back to it. Just looking over the questions here real quick. Okay, preferred UI component library, whether you're using Backbone or Angular. Okay. So as cool as Backbone or Angular are, I mean, even Angular, which provides a bunch of these so-called widgets, when you're creating both Backbone and Angular applications, a lot of times you're going to be using third-party libraries. Maybe you're using Dojo. Maybe you're going to make use of Kendo UI, what have you. So with Backbone, because Backbone isn't opinionated about how you hook things together in terms of your view, you can basically make use of any UI library that you want to out there, and the standard way in which you would use it is the way in which you would use it with Backbone. With Angular, it becomes a little bit more complex. Because of the two-way data binding system with Angular, whatever third-party component you use, you basically need a way to take that component and tie it into the digest loop so that it receives updates from the model, and it can send updates to the model. A lot of the more popular libraries have this data binding process built into them, and they're usually called like Angular extensions. So like Kendo UI has Angular bindings that are available for it. And so basically you can just go buy Kendo or whatever, and you can drop it right into your Angular application, and you can use the Angular bindings, which really do nothing more than provide directives. So you actually get a directive to make use of your Kendo grid, and you can make use of those Angular bindings. If you find yourself in a situation where there's a particular UI component that you want to use, but there aren't any pre-written Angular bindings for it, then you can simply create your own custom directive. And you can take that custom directive and you can wrap it around that component, which is really doing nothing more than hooking into the digest loop by having the ability to send and receive data against Angular's scope model, and build your own directive, and you're up and running. And the nice thing about it is then you can just easily reuse that directive across all of your applications that you're writing. Now, the key to using Angular is this, okay? Backbone, you can basically get up and running in a day, and you've pretty much mastered and understood what Backbone can do. If you start adding in all the other libraries you use with Backbone, that's not really the case. But in terms of Backbone itself, you can get up and running with that in a day. Angular is much more complex. It's much larger. It's this full-blown opinionated framework. To really use Angular, you really have to kind of dive into it and understand what it's doing. I find that most people get frustrated with Angular and abandon it because they really didn't take the time to understand what it's doing. Instead, they watch some little 5-minute tutorial, and it did the little demo that I showed you where you could type in the text box and it updated the view, and they were excited about that. They started trying to build a real application, and they found out that there was a lot more they needed to learn, and they give up and walk away from it. The truth is, it's not really all that hard to learn all of these things about Angular and understand what it's doing. And the truth is, once you understand what it's doing, it can make your life a lot easier. And directives especially are really cool. And they're really cool with what you can do with them and their reusability and how they work. The key is taking the time to understand what's going on. It's kind of like jQuery. Most people go out to Stack Overflow. They copy some type of jQuery snippet into their application and it works, and they think they're jQuery experts. But the truth is they don't really know what jQuery is doing. They don't know why it's doing it the way that it's doing it. They're just lucky that that piece of code is actually working with their application. If you're going to build a real live JavaScript application, you need to understand what your tooling is doing. So whether it's jQuery, whether it's Backbone, or whether it's Angular, you need to take the time to understand how it works. 9 times out of 10, when I've actually seen people go from not knowing how it works to actually knowing how it works, then when they start to use Angular, they love it. It's like, oh, I get it now. It's not so magical. Now I understand what the digest loop is doing. I understand two-way data binding. I understand how directives work. You know what? This makes my life so much easier. In fact, most of the blog posts you'll see out there written by people who tear down Angular and oppose it, if you read their blog post, you're going to find that a lot of their technical information is actually wrong. The reason they don't like Angular is because they just don't understand how it works. And so they write these posts opposing it, when the truth is they just don't really know why it's doing what it's doing. And that's one of the benefits to doing actual like in-person classroom training, where you actually bring in somebody who knows how Angular works. You take a few days to really understand what it's doing, and then you're up and running, and you're actually able to use Angularjs, leverage all the great things that it offers you, and build some really nice applications with it. It's a very capable framework, and it does a lot of different things. And like anything else, you have to know your tooling if you want to be successful with it. All right. I had a question about my development environment that I'm using. Basically, I'm using Atom.io. If you want to, you can take a look at the web page here. It's an editor, I believe. It's been put together by GitHub. And I'll kind of move my little window here out of the way. So it's called Atom.io, and it looks very much like Sublime. Sublime is a great text editor. I own a license to it. I don't want to take anything away from Sublime. But Atom is basically a text editor. Believe it or not, it's actually written in JavaScript. It looks very similar to Sublime. It's open source and free, and it works on Windows, Mac, and Linux. I use it all the time, and that's what I'm using for my demonstration. The reason I use Atom for my demonstrations is that it doesn't have any IntelliSense or anything like that. There's no complicated IDE that we have to contend with. I find a lot of times when doing presentations, the IDE itself can kind of distract from what it is we're trying to learn. And so I kind of like the nice, clean, plain interface of Atom, and I like the fact that it's open source and free, and it's just a great product, and it's written in JavaScript. It's actually pretty cool. Let's take a look now. I think that's pretty much all of the questions. Oh, wait a second. Okay. What are the testing best practices for Angular.js? Okay. So this is actually one of the coolest things about Angular is the testing of it. Angular.js has been built from the ground up to be fully unit testable. So in Angular.js, where you have your controllers that we've seen, and you have your directives and your filters and your services, you can isolate each of those things from the rest of your application, and you can actually unit test them. So with a controller, you're unit testing the controller to make sure that it changed the scope, that it manipulated the scope the way that you wanted it to be manipulated. With a filter, you're unit testing that it's actually transforming the input value the way you want it transformed, or a service, you're testing that your function actually did what it was supposed to do. Or like with the directive, you're testing that it actually manipulated the DOM the way you wanted it tested. Now, the most common way to do unit testing with Angular is to make use of the Jasmine unit testing framework, and that's the one that I regularly go over when teaching Angular classes. Basically, it allows you to Angular has this entire mocking framework that allows you to inject the services that you specifically need for doing unit testing. It allows you to mock the data that can come back from HTTP service calls using the HTTP backend service. If you're a test-driven development shop, it's really nice because you can basically write your unit tests and then code your Angular.js components, making sure that your unit tests are passing, and it really makes it easy to really follow that test-driven paradigm and properly unit test all of your various Angular components. That is one big, huge advantage to Angular, is the ability to do that. Let's see here. Okay, so someone's asking about comment here. So their statement is that comment is a web application model in which a long-held HTTP request, basically called long polling. So newer browsers, modern browsers, and modern web servers support something called WebSockets, which basically allow bidirectional communication between the web browser and the server. So once the web browser establishes the WebSocket, a web browser can send data to it, to the server, and the server, if it wants to, can push data to the web browser. If your browser or server don't support WebSockets, you can make use of long polling, which maintains that open connection. Now, I've never made use of comment before, but I have seen demonstrations of it, and basically it provides a mechanism for doing this. You can absolutely use comment for that purpose, to do that connection. I've never tried to integrate comment before with Angular, but one of the things that I do when I do Angular classes is I'll do demonstrations on how to create an Angular service that can actually connect to a WebSocket server and send data back and forth, and actually have that work in an Angular application. And then you could easily set it up to also do long polling, and then Angular could then choose which approach to use based upon the capabilities of the web browser and the web server. So I would imagine it would be possible, if you wanted to, depending upon how comment is structured. If comment is more of a library, you could take comment, wrap an Angular service around it, and then you could make use of its ability to actually send that data back and forth. All right, the data masking question. Okay, all right, I see where you sent me some additional information. Okay, so on the data masking, you're basically asking how can Angular work so that it can mask data? So, for example, typing in, I don't know, like a social security number or a password, what have you. Okay, so ultimately, if we think about data masking, it's basically applying some type of JavaScript to an input element. And as data is typed into that input element, that JavaScript function takes that input and stores it in a private variable while changing the actual characters that are displayed in the input element. Okay? Now, the question would be, how would you implement something like that in Angular? All right? If you think about it, pulling data out of an input element and changing the contents of that input element is DOM manipulation. We're basically manipulating the value attribute of the input element. So whenever we do DOM manipulation tasks in Angular, we do that by creating a custom directive. Okay? Now, one of the cool things about Angular is that we have something called Angular Forms. And Angular Forms basically provide this really nice system of custom validation, the ability to hook into view changes before the models are updated, or hooking into model changes before the view is updated, all that kinds of stuff. And we can, of course, wire up any type of event that we want. So if you wanted to do data masking, you could create your own custom directive that would then mask the data the way you wanted it masked, and you would hook it into that whole Angular form system so that when people typed into the box, you could then grab the data and stick it on your model while updating the actual control to display the masked out text that you wanted to display. All right, I think that pretty much wraps it up for our questions here. I want to thank all of you for coming out here today. I've got a couple, let's see here. I'll pick up our little slideshare real quick and we'll go ahead and finish up. So today we took a look at the problem that Backbone in Angular, so the problem that Backbone in Angular.js solved. We also took a look at some of their similarities and differences. We took a look at understanding what frameworks and libraries are. We also took a good look at two-way data binding and some of the benefits and limitations of it. And then I quickly showed you guys the Browserify stuff to set up the web application. For those who are interested and you want to learn more about Backbone or Angular or using JavaScript itself, I find a lot of developers just don't even really know that much about JavaScript if they use it all the time. WebAge provides a number of different courses that you can sign up for. We can send trainers out that will teach you these things and really open your eyes up to what these frameworks and libraries can do and really teach you how they work. Not just do the little 5-minute demo, but really show you what's going on underneath the hood. And here's my information. You're welcome to contact me. Feel free to send me an email if you have a question. I don't mind answering them. I do a lot of community group type speaking, and people email me questions all the time, and I'll do my best to get back to you as quickly as possible. And if you're interested in signing up for a class, here's some contact information as well. And then, of course, we have the Backbone and Angular.js websites. And as just a final comment before we sign off here, both Backbone and Angular.js are both very high quality, excellent to use JavaScript solutions for solving the single web page application problem. It just really boils down to what your preferences are, the specific needs of your project, but whether you choose to use Backbone or Angular, you will have a quality solution that will definitely help to solve your client's problems. Thank you again, everybody, for coming out to the webinar. I've had a great time answering your questions, and I wish you all the best of luck as you continue to do your future development. Thank you very much.